In a fog-drenched, fictional port city reminiscent of the 1930s, a clockmaker is found dead inside a vault that was sealed from the inside. The mystery involves temporal paradoxes, hidden legacies, and a city where time itself feels like an enemy. The fog did not merely settle over the city of Oakhaven, it possessed it. It was a thick, sentient veil that muted the frantic pulse of the cobblestone streets and turned the gaslights into sickly, bleeding orbs of amber. The harbor was a graveyard of rusted hulls, and the air tasted of salt, coal, and secrets long buried beneath the tide. Inspector Elias Thorne stood before the grand atelier of Julian Vane, the city's most reclusive horologist. The heavy oak doors had been splintered, not by the crude force of a burglar's axe, but as if the wood had succumbed to a sudden, violent aging, decaying into dust in the span of a single heartbeat. Thorne stepped over the threshold, his leather boots crunching on the remnants of what had once been solid timber. Inside, the atelier was a sanctuary turned into a graveyard of gears. Thousands of clocks, grandfather, carriage, and pocket-sized, ticked in a dissonant, chaotic symphony. It was a rhythmic madness that clawed at the senses, an auditory manifestation of 1,000 different moments failing to align. But at the center of the room, the great iron vault stood agape, its heavy doors swinging on silent, impossibly polished hinges. Julian Vane lay sprawled upon the mahogany floor, his limbs arranged in a pose that suggested he had been trying to protect something invisible. He was a man of fine, scholarly features, now rendered static in a mask of profound, terminal astonishment. His pocket watch, a masterpiece of Vane's own creation, was clutched so tightly in his right palm that his skin had bruised into the shape of a brass gear. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and the air around the body carried the scent of ozone and bitter almonds. The vault was sealed from the inside, "Inspector," the young constable whispered, his voice trembling like a reed in the wind. He stood near the door, refusing to step into the room's inner circle. The tumblers were set to a sequence of prime numbers that hasn't been touched in a century. And yet, the vault opened of its own accord at midnight. My officers heard the click from 3 streets away. Thorne leaned closer, his eyes scanning the intricate patterns of dust undisturbed on the floor. He noted the absence of footprints leading away from the body, despite the fine layer of brass filings covering the floor like gold-colored snow. He felt the air grow unnaturally cold, a localized frost that seemed to radiate from the corpse itself, crystallizing the sweat on Thorne's own brow. Something had been stolen from the vault, something that ticked with a resonance that defied standard physics. Thorne could hear it now, faint, rhythmic, vibrating through the soles of his boots and settling into his very bones. It was a tempo that quickened when he looked at the dead man's watch and slowed when he looked toward the fog-filled window. The city's heartbeat had skipped a beat, and Thorne knew that in Oakhaven, when the clocks fell silent, the hunt for the truth began in the dark. He looked up at the ceiling, where 100 pendulums hung frozen in mid-swing, and realized that Julian Vane hadn't been killed by a man, he had been killed by a paradox. The cold in the atelier remained, a stubborn, frigid draft that ignored the laws of thermodynamics. Thorne stood up, his joints protesting in the silence. He moved toward the mahogany desk, where a sprawling map of Oakhaven lay pinned under a heavy glass paperweight. Curiously, the map was marked not with landmarks or districts, but with a series of intersecting geometric lines, a blueprint of the city's underground clockwork foundations. "Constable," Thorne called out, his voice sharp against the ticking. "Who was the last person to enter this shop before the alarm was raised?" The young officer hesitated, shifting his weight. "No one, sir. The logbook shows that Vane had not received a visitor in 3 weeks. He was obsessed, they say. Locked himself in to finish his final commission." "And the client?" "Anonymous, sir. Paid in gold sovereigns dropped through the mail slot. A man of status, judging by the wax seal left on the initial correspondence, a crest I haven't seen in my 20 years on the force." Thorne picked up a discarded scrap of parchment from the desk. It was covered in Vane's frantic, elegant handwriting. The sequence is not a calculation, it is a key. The gear does not turn the wheel, it turns the memory. Thorn turned his attention back to the corpse. He pulled a fine silk handkerchief from his pocket and carefully pried the pocket watch from Vane's stiffening fingers. It was cold, not the cold of a metal object in winter, but the absolute, soul-sucking cold of a vacuum. As the watch touched his palm, the dissonance in the room shifted. For a fleeting second, the ticking stopped entirely. In that silence, Thorn heard a voice, not Vane's, but something layered, mechanical, and distorted. Midnight is not the end, Elias. It is the hinge. Thorn gasped and dropped the watch. It hit the floor with a dull thud, not of metal on wood, but of stone striking stone. The floorboards beneath it began to pulse, a faint, rhythmic glow emanating from the seams. He realized then that Vane hadn't been murdered to silence him. He had been murdered because he had succeeded. He had found a way to bridge the architecture of the city with the mechanics of time itself, and someone in the city's upper echelon was desperate to keep that door locked. The hunt had changed. This wasn't just a murder investigation, it was a race to recover a weapon that could rewrite the history of Oakhaven. Thorn stepped out of the atelier and into the embrace of the Oakhaven night. The fog was thicker now, a swirling, oppressive tide that swallowed the gaslight and muffled the distant, rhythmic clangor of the harbor cranes. He felt the weight of the pocket watch in his coat pocket. It was a leaden, pulsing presence that seemed to guide his steps toward the district of the ironworks, where the city's heart of industry beat with a cruel, relentless intensity. The streets were largely deserted, save for the occasional shadow that darted into an alleyway, sensing the arrival of the lull. Thorn kept his collar turned up against the biting damp, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. He was tracking the scent of ozone and the faint, almost imperceptible metallic humming that seemed to resonate with the watch in his pocket. It was a trail only a man who had stared into the abyss of human greed could follow. He reached the Gilded Spire, a private club frequented by the men who built the city's wealth on the backs of the desperate. The doorman, a man with a face like a slab of granite, moved to bar his way, but Thorn didn't break stride. He flashed the seal he had found in Vane's notes, the same crest he had seen on the mysterious correspondence. The doorman's eyes widened, the granite mask cracking just enough to reveal a flicker of genuine terror. He stepped aside, and Thorn entered the den of the elite. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the murmur of hushed, treasonous conversations. Thorn scanned the room, his eyes lingering on a group gathered around a central table. They were men of power, bankers, engineers, politicians, all of them leaning in toward a figure whose face was obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't approach them directly. Instead, he slipped into a corner booth, ordering a drink he had no intention of consuming. He watched the reflection in the polished glass of the bar. The figure in the shadows reached into a leather case and withdrew an item, a component that matched the brass filings Thorn had found on the floor of the atelier. It was a gear, but not one of gold or steel. It was crafted from a material that seemed to absorb the light around it. They were building something. The murder of Julian Vane wasn't the end of their plans, it was the catalyst. As the figure stood, the light caught the edge of his face. It was Marcus Vane, Julian's estranged brother, a man long rumored to be dead, lost to the depths of the very clockwork he now seemed to command. Thorn's blood ran cold. The hunt had moved from the shadows of the street to the very center of the city's influence, and he was outnumbered, outgunned, and dangerously close to the truth. The ironworks did not merely hum, it groaned under the weight of 1,000 pistons, a labyrinth of steam and soot that bordered the black waters of the harbor. Thorn navigated the gantries with the silence of a predator, his lungs burning from the sulphurous haze. He had followed Marcus Vane's trail through the back alleys, moving past the gargantuan furnaces that illuminated the fog and pulses of hellish crimson. He found the entrance to the lower sanctum, a blast door hidden behind a cascade of high-pressure steam. Inside, the architecture was impossible. The facility was designed like the interior of an enormous, pulsating machine. Brass pipes snaked across the walls like veins, and the floor was a network of interlocking, rotating platforms. In the center, suspended in a magnetic cradle, was the device. A massive, light-absorbing construct that mirrored the gear Thorn had seen in the club. Marcus Vane stood on a dais, his hands dancing across a console of ivory keys. He was not merely operating the machine, he was synchronizing himself with it. Thorn realized with a jolt of horror that Marcus was using the device to harvest the kinetic energy of the city. Every heartbeat, every ticking clock, every footfall on the cobblestones was being siphoned into this singular point of reality. "You're too late, Elias," Marcus called out, his voice reverberating through the metal chamber as if spoken by the building itself. Julian wanted to stop the clock. "I want to control the pace of the world. Imagine a city where the elite can stretch a single moment of triumph into an eternity, while the rest are left to rot in the seconds between." Thorn leveled his pistol, but the air around him became viscous, like walking through deep water. The device emitted a low-frequency hum that turned the very atmosphere into a weapon. As he forced himself forward, Thorn saw the past and future flickering on the walls, a kaleidoscope of Oakhaven's history and its inevitable collapse. He understood now the secret of the murder. Julian hadn't been killed by a machine, but by his own refusal to be a cog in his brother's grand design. Just as Thorn prepared to fire, the rotating platforms beneath him shifted. The machine pulsed, a blinding wave of shadow light erupting from the core. Thorn was thrown backward, the pocket watch in his pocket, the only object unaffected by the field, beginning to vibrate with a frantic, desperate heat. He had to sever the connection, but to do so, he would have to step into the heart of the temporal distortion itself. The world didn't shatter, it frayed. As Thorn lunged into the center of the magnetic cradle, the reality of the ironworks split like worn canvas. For a heartbeat, he wasn't in a factory, he was standing on the cobblestones of Oakhaven 100 years in the past, watching the city's foundations being laid in mud and blood. Then, with a sickening lurch, he was pushed a century forward, witnessing the city as a hollowed-out skeleton of rusted iron and dead clocks. Marcus Vane stood at the epicenter, his form flickering between youth and decrepitude. "You cannot fight the inevitable, Inspector," he roared, his voice echoing from every direction at once. "Time is not a straight line, it is a closed loop, and I am the one who holds the key." Thorn realized the pocket watch he carried was not merely a trinket, it was a stabilizer. Julian Vane hadn't just given him a piece of evidence, he had gifted him the only anchor in a storm of shifting centuries. As the temporal distortion intensified, drawing the very air out of the room, Thorn didn't aim his weapon at Marcus. He aimed it at the heart of the light-absorbing gear, using the watch as a focal point to channel the static resonance. He pulled the trigger. The sound was not a gunshot, but the crystalline chime of 1,000 clocks striking midnight in unison. A shockwave of pure, unfiltered time erupted outward, colliding with the device. The factory groaned as the reality of the present began to reassert itself with violent speed. Marcus screamed as the temporal loop collapsed around him, his body trapped in a rapid oscillation of age, seconds flickering like frames in a broken film projector. The magnetic cradle collapsed. Thorn was thrown across the platform, the world turning into a blurred vortex of brass and shadow. As he slammed into the cold concrete floor, the hum that had plagued the city for days ceased abruptly. The deafening silence that followed was the most beautiful thing Thorn had ever heard. The factory lights flickered and died, leaving only the dim, natural glow of the moon filtering through the high, soot-stained windows. Thorn lay in the debris, gasping for breath, the pocket watch in his hand finally still and silent. The silence that reclaimed the ironworks was not merely an absence of noise, it was a heavy, suffocating shroud. Thorn lay amidst the tangled ruins of brass and shattered glass, his lungs burning with the metallic tang of spent time. The great machine, once a towering monolith of ambition, was now nothing more than a twisted skeleton of cooling iron, silent and inert. Where Marcus had stood, there was only a fine, shimmering dust, the remains of a man who had sought to master the infinite and been consumed by it. Thorn hauled himself to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest. He looked down at the pocket watch in his hand. The glass face was spiderwebbed with cracks, and the hands were frozen at exactly 1 second past midnight. As he stepped out of the lower sanctum and back into the cool, cleansing fog of Oakhaven, the city felt different. The frantic, dissonant ticking that had echoed through his head for days had vanished. The harbor lights no longer seemed like bleeding orbs, but simple, comforting beacons guiding ships home. The oppressive weight that had settled upon the streets like a fever dream had broken. Thorn walked until he reached the river bank. He stood there for a long time, watching the dark water churn against the stone pylons, the mist swirling around his ankles like a ghost. He thought of Julian Vane, a man who had realized the danger too late, and of the secret that would now remain buried in the dust of the factory. He would file his report, of course, a version of the truth involving an industrial accident and a tragic structural failure. The city of Oakhaven would continue to breathe, to age, and to fade in its own natural time, safe from those who would hoard its moments. He raised his hand and cast the broken watch into the depths. It sank without a splash, swallowed by the river's timeless current. Thorn turned his back on the water and walked toward the rising sun. He was weary, his coat tattered and his spirit bruised, but for the first time in his life, the seconds ticked by with a gentle, rhythmic grace. The case was buried, the paradox resolved, and the inspector finally had the one thing he had been hunting for all along. A moment of his own.